Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for
Hello.
doing this. Can you guys see the screen that I put up?
Yeah, I can see everyone.
Children?
The children and the candle?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I see that Sami is with us.
Hello, Rav.
Hey, Sami. How are you?
Good.
Okay, let me arrange things here.
This room.
Hi, Helen.
Hi, Hanan.
Hello. Now I lost
Hello.
the control screen.
It's just, it's against those events where you end up being so proud of where you were.
Just
and
go up
so,
to the top. Just
everyone was praising Charles and Tommy. I said, well, because Charles and Tommy spoke, and I said, well, Charles is the whole package. He's intelligent, graceful, humble, accomplished. The other problem is, however, that he's very good looking. My wife is very good looking. God damn it, is what I wrote right in chat. 200 people can see it.
Could he see it?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
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 Hello. I'm going to put my earphones in. Hey, for sure, my love.
Jason says read it by the end of the week.
Okay, great. Can't wait. Okay, sweetie. Have a great afternoon.
39 personnes déjà.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know whether you can hear me.
I just heard someone.
Sorry?
I said I just heard someone speak, so we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you very well. I'm Gilles
Let
Amado.
me do this.
I'm from Paris.
Started to call Clarice on the
Welcome.
day or
only
something.
see three. I only see 3 pictures. How many people are on?
There's about 40.
I don't see 40 though. How do I get everybody?
49.
Yeah, the same with me.
scroll down.
There is an arrow that you
Some of
can.
us are on by mobile.
There's an arrow which you can move on the side of the display, but I have no idea how to see everyone together. Like there must be something in the settings which you can do. But you can move with the arrow and then see the rest of the participants in it. But in order to see them at the same time, you have to change something in the settings so that you can see 48 people at the same time or something like that.
I just lost me.
Somebody is sharing he's sharing his מסך.
Yes.
זה פחות נוח לראות את כולם כשהמסך בעצם משותף, רק שנדע.
Okay. I can put an end to that when we start, another minute or two.
אפשר גם להקטין את המסך השמור, למזער אותו די הרבה, ואז רואים בכל זאת איזה 15 חבר'ה לפחות, יותר.
Here.
So the top right of the screen.
I put an end to the sharing of the screen. Is that helpful to anyone?
Hanan, this is Alan Byrne. Hello.
Hello, Alan.
How are you?
Very well. How are you? I see your name. I don't see your picture, but I see your name.
Yes, well, I didn't want to clutter the screen with unnecessary photos. I can put my video on there. I just wanted to tell you that I think that by sharing the screen, you're making it's maybe a little more difficult for each of us individually to decide what we're seeing on our screen.
Yeah, yes. I just put an end to that.
Share the screen.
Yeah,
just
super.
don't share the screen.
Much better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Oh, wow. Okay. Then we can look in the right side of the screen up, and we can choose right up of the screen.
No.
But everyone should be muting his microphone because we're hearing a lot of noises from many people at the same time. So it should be good to mute everyone's microphone.
Hanan?
Yes.
You can mute all of us if you like.
I'm doing that right now. Thank you.
Okay.
I have just muted everyone. The only way to get yourself unmuted will be to raise your hand or to write something in the chat box. So let's begin. Thank you everyone for joining us. What I'd like to do in the first 2 or 3 minutes is to ask you to introduce yourselves. Now, we can't do that orally, it would be a big mess, but we have the chat box, and I hope that many of you are able to use the chat box. So if you can, just write a word or 2 or 5 or 2 sentences about yourself in the chat box. We'll take a minute to write and to look at what each other wrote in place of a social hour of introducing ourselves. We'll take 2 minutes for that, and then we will begin our program. You can tell us where you're from. You can tell us who you are. You can just write your name. Well, I really enjoyed seeing what everyone has to write about themselves. Nice to see there are people here from around the world. So let's begin. Today, beginning with the onset of darkness and continuing until tomorrow at dusk, is the 27th day of the Jewish month of Nisan of the year 5780. It is Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah U'Gvura, Holocaust and Heroism Memorial Day, Remembrance Day. It is a somber day of national mourning for the Jews of the State of Israel and for Jews around the world, a time at which we remember the 6 million who were murdered. During this 24 hours and leading up to them, Israeli newspapers talk about the Holocaust as do the radio programs. Songs of mourning permeate the airways, and films of the death and destruction of the Holocaust fill the television stations. Flags are flown at half-staff, and the whole country observes 2 minutes of silence while a siren goes off at 10 a.m. Tuesday morning. There are special ceremonies around the country. An essential ceremony is broadcast on national television. I actually was just watching it. Synagogues and Jewish community centers very often arrange their own events, whether here in Israel or around the world. Our event here on Zoom right now is one of hundreds, if not thousands, of events taking place around the globe. But our event is a bit different than most, if not than all of the others. Usually the ceremonies and the discussions are about the horrors of the past, about the Jews who were murdered, about the Nazi machine of mass annihilation, about how the world let it happen. We mourn and we vow never to forget. Such memory is crucial, and it must be crystal clear that tonight's program is not meant as an alternative to any of that. We honor all of that very much. Tonight's program is in addition to that and not in place of it. The lesson we all take from the Holocaust is never again. For some of us, the primary message is never again. Never again shall such a thing happen to any people anywhere in the world. And for others, the primary message is never again shall such a thing happen to the Jewish people. This latter approach says that we learn the hard way that the rest of the world will not take care of us, so we must take care of ourselves. The first understanding of never again is a universalistic one, while the second approach is a particularistic one. In a certain sense, the state of Israel, many of its attitudes and policies and even institutions are an expression of this latter approach, the particularistic one. It is very important to grapple with the larger implications of these two approaches, to flesh out their moral, their psychological, and their behavioral implications, both for individual identity and for the collective identity of the Jewish people. And parenthetically, I'll mention that for those who participated in my Zoom presentation last week about the lesson to be learned from the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt some 3,000 years ago, you may be able to see some clear parallels. But it's often difficult to flesh out the implications of our own identity. Sometimes we need an other who can serve as a mirror into our own souls. That may be one of the functions and the benefits of this program of ours. When our Palestinian panelists tell us how Jewish memory of the Holocaust and how the vow of never again plays out for them in their society, how they experience it, we may be able to see and understand things about ourselves that otherwise we might not see and might not understand. And better self-understanding is always a good thing. Before we begin, I want to introduce, for those of you who don't know her, Roots Shorashim Judur, the Israeli-Palestinian grassroots initiative for understanding nonviolence and transformation. Roots works in the heart of the conflict in the Palestinian territories that many Jews call Judea and Samaria. There, we endeavor to build human bridges of acceptance, of recognition, of partnership, of trust, and of empathy between the two peoples who live side by side but completely separate from one another. Through face-to-face meetings and joint programs, we try to begin healing what I call the hubris of exclusivity, a disease that leads both sides to deny the existence, the narrative, and legitimacy of the other side. We in Roots, who are sponsoring this program now, believe that we are laying the groundwork, the human groundwork that is necessary for a political solution that will bring peace and justice to the tiny strip of land that both sides, Palestinians and Israelis, call home. Our organization in the US and around the world is called Friends of Roots. Friends of Roots supports the work of Roots and connects Roots to people around the world for whom it is important to bring an end to the bloodshed, the suffering, and the injustice that defines the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. Friends of Roots works against the export of the conflict to the four corners of the globe and instead tries to bring understanding, empathy, and partnership to Muslims, Jews, and Christians wherever they may be living. Roots and Friends of Roots arranges North American speaking tours 2 or 3 times a year for a pair of Roots activists, one Israeli and one Palestinian. We speak in universities, churches, mosques, and synagogues. These tours are one of our primary means of bringing in the funds that allow Roots to operate and to grow. Our spring tour that was supposed to have taken place last month was, of course, canceled. This Zoom event right now is the third of its kind. These events being an offspring of the new reality in which we are all living for the past 4 to 6 weeks. We are planning, we in Roots, we're planning on there being more events like this. If I have your email address, you'll be notified. If I don't have your email address, you can send it to me. I'll also introduce myself. I'm Hanan Schlesinger, Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger. I'm one of the founders of Roots, together with other Israelis and Palestinians, and I serve today as the Director of International Relations for Roots. We have with us tonight 3 Palestinian panelists. I'll mention their names and introduce them each when we come to his turn. They are not experts on the Holocaust. They are not academics or historians or authors or sociologists. They are just Palestinians. However, they're not your average Palestinian in the sense that all 3 of them have connections to Jewish Israelis and have been transformed by those connections. They are among the Palestinian activists of Roots, our 3 panelists. One of them was one of the very first Palestinians that I ever met, and meeting him was among the things that changed my life. 2 of them have said that meeting me and meeting other Israelis in Roots has changed their lives. All 3 of them certainly have a broader perspective than most Palestinians and have thought about and have grappled with issues that most Palestinians have not been exposed to. I want to say lastly that I do not know exactly what you will hear during our program. The speakers represent no one but themselves. You may hear positions that infuriate you or make you roll your eyes. You may hear opinions that drive you to despair, or on the other hand, fill you with hope. There may be insights that have the immediate ring of truth, and it may be all of the above. All told, I'm pretty sure that your perspectives will be widened and that you may hear things that challenge you and make you think. At the end of hearing from our 3 speakers, there'll be ample time, so I hope, for Q&A, questions and answers. So now, I'm going to make sure that our first speaker is with us. I'm going to ask, is Bilal Arar on the call? Hey, Bilal, are you on the call? You are. I'm not sure. Did I hear from Bilal?
What?
If I don't hear from Bilal, we'll go to the second speaker, to Noor. Bilal, are you with us? I guess Bilal is not with us yet. We will go to Noor. Noor Awad, are you with us?
Yes, Hanan, can you hear me?
Good. So Noor is with us. So I'm going to take just 30 seconds to introduce Noor. Noor is 28 years old. He's a resident of Bethlehem. He's been an activist in Roots for about 3 years. He is a tour guide and takes many Israelis and Americans and people around the world touring Bethlehem and other areas in the West Bank and the Palestinian territories. Noor is also the English-speaking spokesman for Roots, and he's spoken to certainly over 100 groups that have come to visit the Roots Center in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So, Noor, I hand it over to you. Please,
Hanan, you need to mute everyone.
Yes, everyone else has to mute themselves, but I can't mute everyone because then Noor will also be muted.
No, he can unmute. He can unmute.
Okay, so I will.
You can mute everybody, and he will.
I understand. Okay, so I will mute all, and or allow Noor to unmute himself. Noor, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, Hanan, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Hanan, for the introduction.
unmute.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Noor. I am from Bethlehem, and I work as a tour guide, as Hanan said, and I am an activist. I'm a member of Roots. I speak to a lot of groups that comes to Roots. And Hanan asked me if I want to talk about the Holocaust and how the Holocaust memory affects me as a Palestinian and how I deal with this topic, with this subject. And I thought about it, and I think I can talk on two levels on this subject. One is my personal experience with the memory of the Holocaust, and the second level will be how it affects the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So when I think about it, when I think about the personal experience, knowledge, and learning about the Holocaust and the terrible events that happened in Europe in the Second World War, I think that when I go back in my mind, the earliest time I heard about it, I learned about it was, I don't remember so much from the school actually. I remember mostly, I think the first time that I realized what happened and started to learn about what happened was from a movie, from American, actually from Hollywood movies. That was before actually learning about the subject in the school. And I was always, even as a kid, I was always like curious about history and historical events. And so when we came to learn about this subject in the school, it was, I think, around the 7th grade. And I came with a little bit of knowledge about the subject because I used to, as I said, to watch movies about the Second World War, and I heard a little bit about the Holocaust and what happened to the Jews in Europe. And so the learning process in the school was like this, I think. I had an interest to learn and know more about it. And the way how my school handled it, and I'm saying my school because I think in each school it will be different, despite what the curriculum is. I actually don't remember so much of the curriculum. I think the curriculum just talked about the events of the Second World War and how, like, what led to the war and what happened during the war and what happened after the war. And it mentioned the Holocaust, but I don't remember so much, like talking so much in details about it. But I certainly like remember that the first time that I learned about the Holocaust and the details of what happened, the reaction from me was, and from other Palestinians, from other kids like in my class, was that we were in shock. I think many of the students around me were in shock that something like this happened. And I think on some level, many students were in a shock that this happened to the Jews. And I put here like the word Jews in like between two quotes, because I mean that, you know, as a Palestinian kid in the 7th grade, you already learned about the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, and what happened in 1948, and you know, the conflict. And so they start to think about, this is what happened to our enemy in the past. I think that's how many students or many kids, that's how they start to receive it. That's how they start to think about it. This is what happened to our enemy in the past. I didn't actually like this idea itself. I didn't like this kind of thought that, you know, all of the Jews are our enemy and this is what happened to them. From a young age, I tend to always like separate between the Jews in general as people and as religion, and between the Israelis and our conflict with Israelis. Even at a young age, I thought in a different way, comparing to many of my peers and of my friends in the school. So I didn't look at it this way. I looked on it in a different way, I think. And I remember that it was also in a way problematic, you know, to talk and to learn about the history and to think that this is what happened to a people who we consider our enemy in a way. And when I was in the 7th grade, that was in 2003. So the summer before that, in 2002, actually in the spring in 2002, it was in the peak of the second Intifada, during the protective shield operation and the invasion of cities of the West, in the West Bank by the Israeli military, and the siege of the Church of Nativity that lasted for 40 days with curfews and tanks and a heavy presence of military in the city of Bethlehem. And so we were just like a year after that, and it's still, you know, it affected a lot of my generation, a lot of the students around me. I was affected myself. So I found it also a bit confusing to think about it this way, that those people who suffered in the Holocaust, those are the ancestors or the grandparents or parents of the people who we have this conflict with today. So that's how I came to the subject of the Holocaust. And the other difficult layer, maybe I can call it, is that we in some sense learned that the Holocaust was always utilized by the State of Israel in using it in its narrative as a defense. Whatever Israel did to us as Palestinians, in the way how Israel wanted to address the Western world, to address Europe and the US, it always like used the Holocaust as in a way like a cover story or like an excuse or something like that. So I kind of saw it that way, and I always like I always felt angry the way how the State of Israel used the Holocaust narrative to, in some sense, justify their actions toward us as Palestinians. Now, I didn't learn about the Holocaust from a Jewish perspective. Keep in mind, I learned about it from like just like being curious in history, maybe from an American perspective, from an American lens, and yeah, just like that. I didn't really hear someone Jewish talking about the Holocaust and what happened. Now I moved past that. When I graduated and I became a tour guide, I think I also handled the subject in high sensitivity. I mean, I was always careful how to talk about it when I'm with foreigners, in front of foreigners, how to engage with this subject, especially when I'm with foreigners. So that's how I experienced it later, and but I still had the idea of that Israel is using the Holocaust narrative to justify in some sense what did to the Palestinians. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, it was like when I used to guide like foreigners, and we go to the basics of the conflict, and the establishment of the State of Israel, and that the Jews suffered in Europe from the Holocaust, and they have the right to come back and to establish their country here, and all of these discussions I had with foreigners, that's how we always came to the subject of the Holocaust. And I felt that the Holocaust is being used as an excuse to justify what happened to us. So that's what I'm meaning here. Yeah, I think that later, after I met with Hanan and I met other Israelis and Jews, and I can say I met Jews before I met Israelis. I met American Jews before that. But after I met Israelis, and I had the chance to listen from Jewish and Israeli perspective on the topic, on the Holocaust. It affected the way how I see it. And it affected the way, even though this is very hard for me to say, but affected the way how I do relate to Zionism. When I, as Palestinian, my narrative, Zionism is a form of colonialism. People came from Europe, took our land, and that's how I saw it. But then I entered roots, and I entered this process of reconciliation, and I start to understand the identity of the other side much better. And the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust, was a very important piece in this puzzle to understand how things developed and how it's important in the collective Jewish identity and the collective Jewish memory. And so I start to understand it better, I think, after that. And I can say that it's still difficult to deal with this subject. I mean, I think all of you know the Yad Vashem museum here in Israel, in Palestine, in Jerusalem. I was invited by a friend to go there, and I had always like mixed feelings if should I do it or not. The museum is not far away from a Palestinian village that you all heard of, which is Deir Yassin, and what happened in Deir Yassin in April 1948. So I heard even before I read about it. I read about how the tour of the Yad Vashem is actually how it happens and how people feel about it, and then you leave at the end of the tour of the museum. There is a balcony where I think you see the area of Givat Shaul, and maybe some tour guides, Israeli tour guides, will start to talk about the state of Israel and then how people feel protected now here, and that the Jewish people have now their own country, but not many of them, maybe no one at all will mention, Deir Yassin and what happened also to us as Palestinians. So that's why I have mixed feelings about going to Yad Vashem. But I actually went. I went with this friend, and it was very, difficult, as I expected, to visit the museum, both because of what the museum is telling and about the horrible events of the Holocaust, and the feelings I had at the same time when I walked at the end and I was able to see the area and to see that area and the area of Deir Yassin and to think about it and what happened in Deir Yassin. So that's my experience with the Holocaust in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think in Roots, I was able to listen more to Jewish people, to Israeli people who are talking about this subject, to absorb, to understand better, to not think about it only as just like a political tool or justification or a story that, they are using it in a way against us. But there is still, when I see, when I see accusations, I think all of you remember the time when Bibi Netanyahu kind of in some sense talked about the Holocaust. It was a few years ago. He talked about the Holocaust and he accused Hajj Amin Husseini that in a way that he convinced Hitler to start the annihilation, the process to kill the Jews in Europe, and that he has some responsibility because of what happened. And I remember myself, going back and research and reading more about that period and the connection that the Hajj Amin Husseini had with Hitler and all of that. But that was also kind of a difficult time for me as a tour guide, because again, some people picked up this story, and I felt like it's being used to justify what Israel is doing to us nowadays, and so that was another level. And I still, from time to time, I kind of see when right-wing Israelis, when I follow sometimes their posts and tweets and what they are saying, and especially nowadays when they talk about the Holocaust, when they are not putting it in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when they don't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I have much more ability to listen, to understand, to respect, to feel the sorrow, the sadness, and all of that. But when they use it in justifying Israel or use it just for political reasons for the conflict now, it makes it difficult for me to hear and to feel the empathy and the sympathy in this subject. So yeah, that's what I have. That's what I think about the Holocaust. I hope that was clear.
Yes, Noor, thank you very much. Thank you. We won't ask you questions and have you answer until the end. So we're going to have Bilal speak right now. I want to introduce Bilal. I want to make sure, yes, he's with us. I'm going to unmute him right now. I'll just, I'm actually, so I'll say a word about Bilal. Bilal is 23 years old. Bilal Arar. He lives in Beit Umar, which is a Palestinian town of about 20,000 people. The town is between Bethlehem and Hebron, only about a 6-minute drive from where I live. Bilal is a student of accounting at Bethlehem University, and he joined Roots about 3 years ago as part of our youth movement. And when he finished the program, he stayed with us, and he's become one of our important activists on the Palestinian side. So Bilal, I open it up to you to speak.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and good morning. I'm Bilal Arar, and I want to talk about my personal feelings about the Holocaust in general. And I want to put it more in mix with the region and the Middle East. First, I want to talk about my personal experience when I grew up. In Arabic, the Holocaust is called al-Mahraqa. Al-Mahraqa, it comes from harib, or burning. So in my mind, I always had that idea about Holocaust is related to fire or burning other people. But we didn't have more detailed or understanding of the Holocaust. As I grew up in school and learning about the Holocaust in general, in the books, we didn't learn more in details. Actually, we just learned about the Holocaust in the context of the World War II. That it was one of the results of the World War II, and because of the Holocaust, the Europeans found the best way to compensate Jews is to give them a state and to support Zionism as a compensation for what happened in the Holocaust in World War II. So we didn't go into details, and as I went into discussion with some Israelis, I hear that a lot of them, for example, ask me, there's a lot of the Holocaust, or there are some Palestinians who say that the Holocaust was good, that Hitler burned Jews and all that. And they asked me why you have this kind of let's say, intimidation against Jews. And my personal answer is that it doesn't exist in Palestinian curriculum. We don't have such texts, but the problem is with the teachers. You know, when the teacher is in his class, he can talk whatever he wants. But in school curriculum, we don't have such words or things that say, or something like Holocaust denial or supporting, let's say, the Nazi ideology. Because I have heard that before, that some Palestinians were talking that some Palestinians learned about the Nazi ideology or Nazi perspective about the Holocaust. And I think that it's not true. It's not in the curriculum, but it's from the people, from the community. And I hear that also. I'm not claiming that I didn't hear that. No, I hear that. And when I was a child, I didn't think much about it, because usually I see soldiers and you hear people saying that Jews came, the army Jews, was using Jews as Israelis. And when you see of the suffering that you have that internal feeling that what if, and I know that this is very offensive. I'm trying to give, or trying to back to my childhood and both my feelings as it was when I was a child. I was sometimes thinking that what if Hitler killed all Jews and we don't have this problem, we don't have army people. And as I grew up, I started to relate more when I started to read, and when I started to see the other people, other perspectives to see. And looking around me and growing in the Middle East and seeing the Syrian civil war and seeing the Israel-Palestinian suicide bombings and hearing about Israeli stories and seeing the whole region of the Middle East, I started to think that if we continue to think in that way, we are going to call each other forever. We're not going to reach any kind or any point of understanding each other. And today, I believe, for me, is that we should not put the Holocaust or the Palestinian Nakba in the political when we want to discuss as people, because when we put it in the political context, then I see that there are two responses usually from people. It's either denial, that you go for denying that the Holocaust happened or the Palestinian Nakba happened or something happened, or you go for the distraction strategy, which is when someone is faced with the fact that the Holocaust happened, then he starts to say, that, okay, the Holocaust happened, then why did you did that in Palestinian Nakba, or why you did that? And it prevents people from relating to the Holocaust or relating to this historical event more humane way. And for me, I believe that we should relate in this memory for Palestinians and even in general in the world, not in political context, but more in humane way, even if others want both sides. I'm personally, I agree with that. And more about what I see in the media or on internet in general, things that I feel that hurts me or it's offensive in a way about the Holocaust, but it's not the Holocaust itself. It's the way that I feel that the Holocaust is being used, especially by American institutions. I mean, I'm as a human, as someone who have human feelings and someone who can relate to human pain. And I go, for example, for the IHRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Association, or ADL, and I see them anti-Semitism, let's say, definition. I see that being skeptic about the right for Jewish people, their own state, and I don't see, for example, Palestinian right for their own state or for their own governance, let's say. And I feel I cannot go to Palestinian refugee and tell him that if you deny the right for Jewish people for their own state, then you are anti-Semitic. I don't see any kind of logic to tell, if we want to put that definition universally, I don't see a logic in telling Palestinians that if you deny the Jewish people right for their own state or Holocaust, then you are anti-Semitic. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but this is how I feel. But in general, about the Holocaust and about many other genocides, I feel that we should understand them more in human context, and we should not try to deny or to distract ourselves from this historical memory by trying to say that, as I'm seeing around, for example, for the Armenian genocide, when a European country talks about that, then Turkish minister says, okay, you Europeans were colonizers and you killed a lot of people in Africa. And it's all about distracting others and not actually trying to claim our own responsibilities for what other people have done, or claiming that we are not perfect, we're not angels. And this is why I believe that it should be. This is what I have. If you have any other question, I will be open.
Thank you. Thank you, Bilal. Thank you very much. We will leave questions for the end. Now we're going to move on to Sami Awad. I will try to unmute him as soon as I find him on my screen. But first I will introduce Sami. Sami is older than Bilal and then Noor, although not as old as me. Sami lives in Bethlehem. He's he's the founder of the Holy Land Trust in Bethlehem, was its executive director for many years. Today he's the program director. He's given the leadership of the organization to another person to allow him to focus on the projects of creating a better future. So much could be said about Sami. I'll just tell you that he's my teacher. He's my friend. He's my mentor. And there is great, just like there's great love between myself and the other Palestinian members of Roots, Bilal, Noor, and others, there's great love between myself and Sami. Sami, I'll just mention, is also the nephew of a very famous Palestinian, Mubarak Awad, was one of the early teachers of nonviolence in Palestine. And he was deported by Israel over 30 years ago. And Sami is certainly continuing the footsteps of his uncle. So Sami, thank you for joining us. I'm looking on my screen in order to be able to unmute you. So just give me a second.
I got it. I got it.
Got it. Thank you. Very good. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you. Wonderful in the sense of seeing so many beautiful people and faces that I know and have connected with over many, many years. And thank you, Hanan, for this invitation on this very special day. And I have to admit, and also to say that it's not easy, just like what Bilal and Noor said, this is not an easy subject to talk about. A part of it is talking about it from a Palestinian perspective, but also just the general subject by itself. Many of you have been carrying wounds of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. So this is not just the story of a nation, this is the story of your families. And to have an outsider come and speak their opinion into it is not sometimes the best experience one has. I know this as a Palestinian, when foreigners come over and speak into our cause and our issue and our suffering and what we should do and need to do. And so I just want to start by sharing, I understand how this is a very sensitive topic. But for me, it is a topic that I have been engaging in for many, many years now. And so what I'll do today, again, like Bilal and Noor, just build on the same theme of sharing my personal story and experience with the Holocaust, and then maybe talk about the current reality of it. The question I want to start with, and maybe it's not a personal question, but the question is, what if the Holocaust never happened? What if the Shoah did not happen? What if anti-Semitism in Europe for decades and centuries leading up to that day did not happen? What would our reality look like today? And for me, it's not about denying or not denying Israel's existence or not, but even in the existence of Israel, if that event, if that history of discrimination and marginalization and violence against Jews, and again for centuries, not just in the Holocaust itself, did not happen, what would our lives look like today? And I would say it would be different. And then this is how, for me, there is a direct correlation and effect between what happened in the Holocaust, what came after the Holocaust, and the reality that we live in today in the Holy Land. So my personal story, and yeah, as you said, Bilal and Noor are much younger than me, so I can't remember my 7th grade lessons, if we ever studied about it. But I grew up in no knowledge of the Holocaust, other than the books and the movies that we saw. And for me, the experience of learning about the Holocaust first took place in the US when I was there studying. So I did my senior year of high school there, where we studied about the Holocaust. And then in college, when I studied peace and conflict resolution, there was a lot of studying about that. But as a Palestinian, and I would say this on behalf of many Palestinians, there is a disconnect. We do not relate to it. It doesn't make sense for us to talk about something that did not happen in this land and did not happen to peoples who lived in this land. It's like studying about, Bilal mentioned the Armenian genocide or any other genocide in history that happened. It's sad, it's tragic, it's history, it's the past, it's done, it's gone. And so there wasn't any direct connection between the two realities for us as Palestinians growing up. What we had and continue to have to a large extent is the occupation. It is a community that is suffering. It is a community that is restricted on many, many levels. And just to think about the Holocaust that happened in Europe and make it part of our narrative just did not make sense. Now, there was, of course, certain Palestinians who would make the argument, and you've probably all heard this before, which is to in a sense justifying, not justifying, but creating the space where the comparison takes place, that they're doing to us what happened to them. This is something that is common. In it lies, of course, the reality that we don't deny the Holocaust because we acknowledge what happened to them, but they're doing the same thing to us. Or another narrative spoken here is, we are the victims of the most victimized people in the world. If the Jews are going to be claiming the most victimized people in the world because of the Shoah, then we are their victims. And of course, that means we need more pity and more sympathy and more care and more support from the global community. So in general, there isn't denial of the Holocaust. There's a disconnect from it, or we try to put it in the context where we are victims of it as much as the Jews are. This is how basically the two narratives that feed into the Palestinian community. And for me, I grew up in that reality. I grew up in the Holocaust being a far away story for something that happened at that time, 30, 40, 50 years beforehand. And the Jews have gone over it. They have not just survived it, they have actually created something out of the ashes, and something very big and very powerful, and in it very destructive to us as Palestinians. But again, the psychology of it never was introduced or taught to us. The personal and the collective psychology of the direct effect of the Holocaust, and for generations post-Holocaust. When I started Whole Land Trust, we started as an organization that was aiming for ending the occupation. This is what it was all about, ending the occupation and freedom for the Palestinians and peace between Palestinians and Israelis. And like many Palestinians and maybe many Israelis until this day still think that this is a political conflict between two nations that are fighting over the same piece of land, each one claiming through history or through power or through religion or whatever means that this is their land. And of course, other solutions are there, divided, cut it up between you two, you take this and you take that, but it's seen completely as a political conflict with other sort of decorations about it, the religious issues as decoration, the heritage issues as decorations, but not at the core of it. And definitely trauma and fear are not seen at the core of it, even though for me, they are the biggest motivators of how we see each other and relate to each other. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So for me, my experience was pure political, pure liberation. Israel as an occupying colonial force was the enemy. And the only way to achieve peace is by liberating the occupied territories of 1967 from this colonial force, and we will have peace in this land. Psychology, again, was never an issue at all for us. And I would say this even to say even the trauma for Palestinians of 1948 until this day is not seen as a collective psychological trauma. We are still in some sort of denial of it. A big part of it is many still believe that our trauma is still a continuous trauma. So we haven't had sort of a collective post-traumatic stress experience to face this and address it. My introduction at the deepest level to the Holocaust took place when I was invited, and some of you know these names that I will mention, Bernie Glassman, may he rest in peace, and Eve Marco from the Zen Peacemaker community, when they invited me to the Bearing Witness retreat, which they hold every year in Auschwitz and Birkenau, in the death camps in Poland. And I took this invitation on. It was at a time when I was personally going through sort of my beginning stages of a spiritual awakening. It was during the second Intifada. It was after the whole peace process had collapsed. And then I began to ask deep questions of what is this conflict really about, and why did the two-state solution fail, and why all this violence that we are experiencing in such forceful ways. So I began sort of this deep inquiry journey, and within that time, I got this invitation to go to the Bearing Witness retreat, and I went there. And then for me, it's the first time that I've been actually at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I haven't been to Yad Vashem, and I don't know if I will ever go to Yad Vashem, because I think experiencing Auschwitz and Birkenau was a deep enough experience for me to really get the deepest closeness and understanding of what I can of the Holocaust. And of course, I was witness to the atrocity that happened to the Jews of Europe, and of course, as we all know and cannot deny, many other minority and ethnic groups that lived in Europe at that same time. The machinery of destruction that was created, 6 million at least, it's beyond words to express it. And I say this, and I've talked about my experience there many times, and every time I speak about it, I still have a choke in my throat because of just being witness to that. And many of you have heard me share this, that as I also was bearing witness to the history of what happened, I also was bearing witness to a modern way of how the Holocaust was presented to young generation of Israeli kids, which is the ongoing story of suffering of the Jewish people that does not end. And even some of the teachers were using the statements, and we just had Pesach a couple of weeks ago, and the statement that they were using, and it wasn't during Pesach, which is every generation and nation rises up to destroy us. They were telling us, this is who we are as Jews. This is our history. The Holocaust is an episode of a continuous story of suffering that has not ended and will not end, even with the establishment of the state. And every generation and nation will rise up to try to destroy us. And then some of the teachers were actually defining that nation. And it was the Palestinians. If the Palestinians have an opportunity, this is what they will do to you. And that shook me to my core. That was it for me. That was for me the first time I understood what this conflict, this situation that we are living in is all about. Completely embedded in fear and trauma. Fear that is real, trauma that was experienced, trauma that was not healed, and also fear that, as the speaker said, continues to be manipulated by establishments. And the manipulation of fear by political authority is not something rare to Israel. This is how politicians gain power. Fear is the greatest motivator for human behavior and for gaining control. And if you're in the US, you know what this means from 9/11 on, and anywhere in the world, as we are even living today with fascist regimes taken over only through fear of immigrants, fear of minorities, fear of Islamophobia, you name it. Fear is how people are gaining power. So it's nothing unique in Israel, but this is the reality. And as Palestinians, we suffer from that. And at that point, I came back from that experience and I said, this has to be dealt with. It cannot remain as it is. There can never be peace in this land if we do not address the traumas, the collective traumas of both of our communities. And I say this not to compare the two, but to say we're both traumatized in different ways. And we are motivated by our trauma, and we're motivated by our fear. And when there is fear of the other, then there is mistrust. And how can there ever be peace when there is mistrust? And for me, it was quite a lonesome journey for some time. I was talking about it, but never really knowing how to engage in it. And that, I'm just looking at my time as well. And that began,
good.
Yeah, that began to change when I met Sarah Bernstein, I think she's here, from the Rossing Center and Hebrew Union College. And we began to create and then continuous pilot projects of how do we look into collective trauma and address collective trauma as a key component of peacemaking. Yeah, for me, again, I would say I look at even why the peace process has failed so far. And I don't know if you know this or not, the Oslo peace process has been around for more than 25 years. There have been 20 attempts to negotiate the Oslo peace process in the last 25 years, and every time has failed. And I think it's not about strategies, it's not about borders, it's not about issues, technical issues of negotiations. It is embedded in fear. All the negotiations that we have had so far are driven by this existential fear, and especially, I would say, of the more powerful, the Israeli society, and therefore they are negotiating the best security arrangement that they can have to prevent this, I would call, illusionary threat from happening by the Palestinians, because I do not in any way think and believe the Palestinians will be the next nation that will rise and commit the Holocaust if given the opportunity. This is something that I completely dismiss and do not accept. But we have to address that fear if it's there. And for us as Palestinians, our negotiators were again motivated by the existential threat that as Palestinians, if we don't get the breadcrumbs of negotiations, we will lose everything possibility. And therefore we were negotiating from a place of existential fear. And again, lack of trust of the other. And this is why this work that we have begun doing, and I know Roots is doing a lot of work in this as well, we cannot ignore the collective trauma, and we cannot ignore fear and that narrative. And for me, this means, how can we, within the Palestinian community, begin to bring the narrative of the Holocaust in a clearer way as a historic fact, but also not to disconnect it from the reality that we live in. And our oppressor being more powerful doesn't mean that they are less traumatized than us. You know, the tragedy is when you bring fear and you bring power and combine them together, this is a formula for disaster. That's how I see it. And again, on the personal level and on a collective level, a person who is living trauma and fear continuously, let's say from an ethnic group in their community, who may have been hurt by one at a certain point, and you give that person a machine gun, you can imagine what they would do with that machine gun to any person from that other ethnic group that might be even walking outside their home. So absolute power and absolute fear is a formula for disaster, and we need to address this. On the Israeli side, the quest that we are engaging in is, again, how do we, it's not about in any way denying the narrative or undermining the narrative of the Holocaust, but it is about putting it in a place where a story emerges from this, where, as Rav Hanan said, that never again for humanity can begin to be the spoken language of Israeli society, that the movement to end violence and oppression and injustice is what Israeli become motivated for, not isolation and exclusivity and protection of the identity. The opening up to the Palestinians, getting to know the Palestinians, building relationships of mutual trust and respect so we could really begin to build a new vision for the future, embedded in trust and respect, should be the way for us to move forward. And so it's about the Holocaust becoming a catalyst for transformation and for change and for healing, not as Bilal and Noor said, not as the space where it is used and abused for the sake of oppression and justifying oppression and violence towards another people by a historic experience that you have had. So I will stop here, Hanan, and thank you all for your listening.
Thank you very, very much, Sami. So It's time for questions and answers. I'm pretty sure there'll be some serious questions, and that's good. As long as we're all respectful and polite, we can certainly say difficult things and harsh things. So there's two ways to do the question and answers. We could do it both ways. Let's try and start with the chat box. So I'm looking at the chat box. If anyone has a question, you can either just in the chat box write that you have a question, I'll call on you, or you can write the question itself. I'm not talking about raising hands because I can't see everyone on the screen. I can only see 25% of you. So either write in the chat box what your question is, or just write that you have a question and I'll call on you. By the way, as many of you have heard me say, the first question is always the most difficult. So let's start with the second question. So I see that Saskia is interested in saying something. Saskia, would you unmute yourself and speak up?
Thank you, Hanan. Thank you, Bilal, Noor, and Sami. I'm driving in New York, so wonderful to do this in the car. My question is for Sami. Sami, first of all, so wonderful to see you. My question to you is, as the leader and founder of the Holy Land Trust, I know that you've done so many workshops in the last few years, really dealing with trauma, bringing the two sides together. How else are you touching the populations? How else are you kind of reaching a greater group of people outside of your workshops?
Yeah, good to see you too. And you shouldn't be speaking and driving.
I stopped.
Yeah, this is not an easy subject to talk about, and I think as Palestinians we all acknowledge this. And Hanan, I think, mentioned it, like it's very rare to get Palestinians to even talk about it. And so now the way we are doing it is actually through the workshops that we are doing with the Rossing Center and with Hebrew Union College, and in other discussions that we're able to. When I speak the vision of the organization, when I talk about the vision of the organization to Palestinians, one of the key pillars of our work is healing trauma. And so when we talk about healing trauma, it is about healing trauma of both the Palestinian and Israeli Jewish society. And I would, surprisingly say sometimes there is resonance, there is acceptance of this. As Palestinians, we know the history of what it means to live with Jews in this land. And then we know of stories, and my grandmother and father shared stories of good neighborly relationships, friendships, cooperation between them. And so we are not embedded, like, again, many people would like to accuse Palestinians of being embedded in anti-Semitism. We've had our issues, we've had our conflicts, but there isn't anti-Semitism within the Palestinian community or anti-Jewish sentiment, because when we talk about Semitism, this is where we all come from anyway. And so we have a history that is different than the Jewish European experience. And Palestinians know this. You talk to any Palestinian who have sat with their grandfather, they would share stories of knowing Jews, and we work together. And even till this day, with all the mess that we're experiencing with COVID-19, Palestinians are still sneaking in and breaking the walls and barriers, not for peace, but for labor and for work. And their Jewish employers are waiting on the other side and picking them up. And not many people are liking this, but there is even that sense of trust that still exists without even going through security. These Palestinians, thousands, are going to work. I think it puts it more in context for many Palestinians when we talk about the Holocaust in such a way. Not about denying it, not about ignoring it, but putting it in the context of trauma and fear that is collectively experienced by the Jewish people, that we need to address it as part of addressing our own liberation movement as well.
Thank you, Sami. Before Ben speaks, my colleague Shul Yudelman who is the Israeli co-director of Shorashim, of Roots, wrote me privately that he'd like to ask Bilal to say a word about a unique field trip that happened of the Israelis and Palestinians in the youth group of Roots. They went together, Israelis and Palestinians of Roots, these high school students, to Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Museum. They experienced it together. And Shaul suggested we ask Bilal to say a few words about what it was like. He was there to visit Yad Vashem together with Israelis and Palestinians. Could you say a few words about that, Bilal?
Yeah, sure. As you went to in a youth trip to Yad Vashem, and it was the first time going to a museum in my life, not just a museum for the Holocaust. And when I entered and started to see what happened in World War II, I was surprised and I was shocked. And the most thing that touched me is how the Nazi regime, or what their supporters as National Social Party for Germany, is using racial science for convincing other people that Jews are not German, part of the Aryan race. And I'm seeing that today, and in general, I'm seeing that in the modern world today. I'm seeing that we are going into that kind of direction of using science and history more in discrimination against people, and fears about that. Actually, I feel sometimes that I have faith in humanity when I'm seeing that some people are using science to justify such a genocide or justify another ideas that have this kind of fascist ideology about killing other people. And that the Yad Vashem experience didn't stop here. I researched more. I wanted to understand more, and you create a system that can convince million people or soldiers to be part of inhumane genocide. I mean, if I want to put myself as a soldier in World War II, as a German soldier, and I start to read about not following orders in military, and that you cannot, you should obey the orders, and start to read more about Eichmann court in Israel and his own defense, that he was only following orders, and I start to question a lot about what the future will be. If you can create a regime that can convince of people of killing in the worst way, children, civilians, women, I'm afraid that in the future, and I hope that I hope that my feelings are wrong, but I'm feeling that there's a trend today in Europe and in US and Middle East, and I have seen that myself personally. I mean, what I have seen in Yad Vashem, I have seen it. I'm not trying to compare, but I have seen such kind of crimes happening in Syrian civil war and in other regions, and it's really shocking to see that happening in the modern world. And I don't have any words. I feel sometimes that I'm losing faith in humanity. I'm losing faith in the international community to see such kind of genocides happening today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilal. Ben Molov, Dr. Ben Molov would like to say a word. I'll just tell everyone he teaches at Bar-Ilan University, conflict resolution, and has worked a bit with Roots in researching the work that we do on the ground, bringing together Israelis and Palestinians. Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Hanan, and I really appreciated hearing the Palestinian speakers. I really respect the degree of thought and seriousness that you voted to this. But first of all, Hanan, I agree with you about the issue of the two ways in which we can view the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel, I think, tried to bridge the gap, and he said it was a Jewish tragedy, but it was also something universal that we all have lessons to learn about the dangers of prejudice and where it can go, which is something that is relevant to Jews as well, even though we were the primary victim of it. But to Sami, I just had two thoughts. One sort of a question and the other sort of a comment and possibility of suggestion. The first one is you referred to the sort of general thought, what would happen if there weren't a history of anti-Semitism throughout Jewish history, and would things look differently? And that assumes that the only reason that the Jewish people have come back to the land of Israel is because of the issue of security and anti-Semitism. And there's no question it was a major motivating factor. But I think in terms of the core narrative, it really is a secondary issue and not the primary one. It's the core relationship. I mean, I'm a Jew from the United States, and I wasn't pushed down from through anti-Semitism, and Hanan wasn't either. I had visited Jordan, and we had civilization, and the Jordanian guy was extremely passionate, talked about this great civilization and everything, and I think with a degree of longing. And I remember saying to him, and I said, look, we the Jewish people, we're the Nabateans. We were built to civilization, just during the time of the Bible. We were scattered, and but we retained this link and faith and connection. So I would just ask, what about that ongoing tie based on positive affirmation, not just anti-Semitism? And then two, I just wanted to offer a thought. I've had my own background, not only as a researcher, but as an academic activist as well. And in 1999, 2000, after being involved in an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue between students from Bar Ilan and Palestinian students from the University of Hebron as a co-academic facilitator, I was a partner in a developing venture between myself and a colleague at Bar Ilan and two senior faculty at the University of Bethlehem, in which we had gotten funding for a joint course called Understanding Each Other's Discourse. And that was supposed to be a walk through the narratives, etc. And with my Palestinian colleagues, I remember in one day in 1999, we were talking about what the course should look like. And they said, well, we really want our students to go to Yad Vashem because we're against Palestinian denial of the Holocaust. But then they said in the moment afterwards, we also want you to go to a refugee camp because we had, their words, we had our Holocaust, the Nakba, their words, Holocaust. I remember losing about 3 nights sleep over this. How do I frame this? I couldn't accept it as a, as a given that the two experiences are comparable, as a given, as a fact. But I did try to, I suggested framing it when that proposal was accepted, that we have two parallel units understanding the pain and trauma of both sides. The Holocaust is the epitome of the 2,000-year history of Jewish persecution and oppression, and the 1948-1949 refugee experience, coming along the heels of Arab, indignities, etc. And an attempt to establish, a personal, mutual empathy. And then I suggested, by the way, that we have a question for discussion: are the two experiences comparable? But I would say, mutual empathy. And by the way, just one last thing, I just see, if I can, I see a progression in terms of commemoration of the Holocaust in Israel, and I think that Hanan might as well. When Israel was first established, they referred to, heroism during the time of the Holocaust. It was usually armed resistance. Now it's being defined as anything spiritual, interpersonal, anything that you did to make the lot of someone else better. It could be encouragement, it could be, stealing food for someone, it could be whatever. So, when we try to find hope out of this, and maybe, the Holocaust will be something that would be a transcendent basis for hope on both sides as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I'll be very quick to the first point that you said. I think I said in my opening remarks, it's not about denying Israel existing, which in me, it's not about denying Jewish right to be here or that Jews would have returned here. But for me, I think the energy that many Jews came here came from that energy of being completely traumatized, completely fearful, and completely wanting to change the narrative of identity of who we were pre-Holocaust in Germany. And I know you've done a lot of research on this, and many people here have done research on this, the character of the Jew in Europe, and then the character of the Jew in the state of Israel, and how that shifted, and going from the weakness to power, going from the victim to the one who is in control. And I think all of that came with that. But for me, definitely no denial. And I would have actually, my great grandfather welcomed Jews into his home in Jaffa. And this is in the late 19th century. So there was absolutely no denial, and till the date, no denial of Jewish historic right to be here as well. But it's the energy that for me is the shift that happened.
Thank you, Sami. On the chat, Lauren wrote a question. Where or why are there no Palestinian women's point of view here?
Yes, Hanan, why?
So the truth is that I've had discussions on efforts to include a woman in this panel. So I will answer very honestly that I have met many Palestinians in the course of the 6 years of work I've been doing in trying to bring reconciliation to our war-torn land. And perhaps 20% of the Palestinians I meet know Hebrew, another 20% know English, but I have almost never met a local Palestinian woman who speaks English. In other words, the Palestinians who I've met who speak English and or Hebrew, I think are 99% men. For various sociological and historical reasons, there are very few Palestinian women in the area in which Roots does its work who can speak English or Hebrew. I think that's the only reason why there's no woman on the panel, because I couldn't even think of one Palestinian woman who who's a member of Roots and who speaks English. And I'm happy to get suggestions for future panels of Palestinian women who live in the area between Bethlehem and Hebron, or anyone listening today thinks can be invited to a future event that we'll be doing. Mira asks a question. In the youth group of Roots, do the youth from each side talk about these respective traumas? And I guess that's a question to Bilal. In the youth group, did you guys talk about the trauma of the Jewish people and the trauma of the Palestinian people? Bilal. Bilal, can you unmute yourself?
I have connections. Yeah, I hear you.
Did you hear the question?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Can you repeat it?
The question is, in the Roots youth group, when you were a participant, was there discussion of the trauma of the Palestinian people and the trauma of the Jewish people?
Yes, we did really actually discuss the Holocaust. As I said, we went to Yad Vashem together, and we discussed the Nakba. We discussed in general terms, with this more in sort of strong psychological way, because I think, or I believe that because we are young, we were like 19 years old and 17 years old. So we discussed more in the youth feelings of how they feel about the Palestinian Nakba and the Holocaust. It was very important. It was very important discussion. And I think that going to and also going to a Palestinian village that was related in 1948. It was very important to connect to each other stories and to each other identity. And I believe that part of the Palestinian identity is the historical memory of the same for Jews, the historical memory of the Holocaust. And as I said, I read a lot more about the Holocaust, as Sami said, being exceptional, and I know that there's a lot of sensitivity about comparing the Holocaust with other genocides. I understand that, and I don't try to relate to these genocides in general and how it affects people and how it changes people's views about the war and I believe that we should, as Sami said, we should about the whole psychological or social or humane way. This is what I believe personally, and I believe, and there's something that I want to ask others, especially on the idea in general about studying or teaching Holocaust is why I understand that Jews generally study the Holocaust from their own trauma, their own Jewish perspective or Jewish history. But something that I can't understand because I usually try to look on these genocides more in a humane way or in general, in the macro way, not just in specific or details ways, that why the numbers of the Holocaust victims only include Jews, why we don't talk about others who were also victims of this, and why I see a lot of Jewish associations when they ask for teaching the Holocaust, they're teaching the Holocaust only as if the victims were Jews and concentrate, and I feel the kind of discrimination against other victims who have been victims of the Nazi regime, especially in the Holocaust. There have been a lot of people who have been killed, and why we should only take one tip of the narrative and not take the whole picture of the narrative in order to put it in main way rather than more biased way, whatever this way or other people think that Jews for them is their history. When I want to teach that, for example, in Palestinian schools or in international schools, I also don't want to discriminate against victims who have been victimized or victims of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. Thank you.
That's a very important issue that you brought up. I'm trying to think if there's a way to deal with it in this forum. I don't think that this is the forum to deal with it. So I will just put that on the back burner for thought.
Thank you.
Regina wants to ask a question. I'm reading from the chat box. Can our speakers address the upcoming Israeli-Palestinian joint memorial ceremony in the context of your moving words? In the questions and answers, we haven't heard from Noor. Noor, are you still with us? Would you like to try and talk about the joint Israeli-Palestinian memorial service that will be another, I think, week and a half?
Yes, I am with you, Hanan. Yeah, I don't have any like information in particular about the event. I know about the event from before. I think the event is very courage. It's very brave. I think it brings the two sides closer to each other in a way. That both sides realize the humanity of the other side by seeing, you know, the suffering of each side and experiencing how the other side suffers from this conflict and the pain they go through together. I think this experience of sharing the pain together is very powerful, and it's one why there are voices in the Israeli society and Palestinian society who will attack and stand against such you know, an activity. And I remember from last year how many activists, political, you know, and writers and people in the Israeli society who wrote against the joint memorial ceremony, and also the criticism from the Palestinian side that this is just another, you know, normalization of the occupation and what they are doing to us and all of that. So yes, that's what I think about. But I still in the ceremony and this particular event, very brave, maybe I can say advanced, and maybe it's in a way also target the core of the conflict. As Sami said, that the conflict is not only about political reason, it's not only about the land and borders and this stuff, but the fear inside of us and the story and the identity we have. And so that's why this event is in a way is very controversial or very powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Noor. I'm going to not let Sami or Bilal relate to the question unless you really have something important to say. I want to go into some other questions. I see that that Alan Byrne asked a question for me. How do Jewish ideas of Amalek affect the possibility of dialogue with the Palestinians, and what can be done about that? Very briefly, I will say that Amalek is the name of an ancient nation that, according to the Torah, Jewish scripture, are considered to be the worst enemies of the Jewish people. And there is a command in the Torah to wipe out their memory. That means to kill them. Now, thank God, Jewish law says that nation no longer exists. There are no more Amalekites on this planet, so that in practical terms, that commandment to kill them is no longer operative. But nevertheless, Alan is certainly very correct in his point that the fact that there is a demon, as it were, in Jewish history, that we have a sense that there are those whose whole raison d'etre is to kill us, and we have to strike back, take revenge, and kill them before they kill us. That consciousness is deeply embedded, I think, in Jewish identity, and it is indeed one of the many stumbling blocks to Palestinian-Israeli reconciliation. So I can just tell Alan and all of you two things. One is that this matter of Amalek is related to the Jewish holiday of Purim, because in the historical events we remember in Purim, those who tried to kill us in Persia 2,500 years ago, Haman, well, the text says he was an Amalekite, and he's seen as the continuation of the biblical Amalekites in the time of the Torah, when the Jews left Egypt, who tried to kill us. And for some Jews, Purim becomes a time of remembering those Amalekites who rise up against us. We have to rise up before they rise up against us. There are some Jews who see incarnations of Amalek in every generation. Some, I would say, radical Jews see the Palestinians as the modern incarnation of Amalek, and we have to kill them before they kill us. So the two things I would say is that this matter of Amalek was actually the center of discussion in our Jewish Christian Roots Dialogue group before Purim, and it was also the subject of study in our Muslim Jewish dialogue group. Important things that we have to grapple with. The Palestinians have to know what's in Jewish consciousness, and Jews should struggle with what's in our consciousness and identity. And the second thing I can say is that perhaps in a future Zoom session with all of you or some of you, we can devote it to this question of Amalek. I think it's an important thing to do. I'm looking at the chat box. There's a name I can't pronounce, Semayat asks, what can we do to diminuate the fear that has been the center of discussion tonight? Sami or Noor or Bilal, do you want to talk about what can we do to lessen the fear?
Well, I will quickly, to give time, because I know we're running out of time as well.
Yes, yes.
Through our religions and cultures, we have amazing values that are so deeply rooted in justice and peace and righteousness. And so for me, again, it's not about denying, but it's about how do we manifest those values that are also core in connecting with others, in showing compassion for the stranger, in welcoming the foreigner, in treating the other as an equal. To put emphasis on these values becomes very important, and to begin teaching these values, not just teaching them in seminaries or schools or yeshivas, but to actually practice these things. And this is something that people can do anywhere in the world. And I know, like this time that I have to say this is one of the best seminars in the last few weeks, because we haven't talked about COVID-19 this whole time. But just to say, this is a time when people have a choice. Either they go into hiding and go into security, go into fear, or like what many people, I know many here are doing, is opening up, becoming more charitable, more giving, more caring, more connecting. It's a choice. You know, we could look into text from religion and pick and choose what we want. And instead of choosing only and exclusively those who create separation and fear, we could also choose the ones that bring people together. And that's what I would encourage, to move from the teaching also into action. And I say this for all religious cultures and traditions that are presented here.
Thank you, Sami. Time is short. I don't want to make our panelists stay longer than we had said they would. So let's just do one more question. Let me tell you, there are 52 questions that we're not getting to, 52. So the last question that we will read, and this one is directed to Sami and others, comes from our good friend Yeheskel Landau in the States. And Yeheskel asks, do you see the challenging task of trauma healing as part of a more general process of truth and reconciliation, as in the South African experience? Could a similar collective transformation happen in Israel and Palestine? If so, what would it take to bring it about? Sami, and then if Noor and Bilal want to speak, and then we'll close.
Well, I will be the optimist and say we could learn from the South African model and learn from the mistakes that happened in the South African model and do a better one for us, without going into the details. But people can research the details of what happened in that model, where there was breakdowns that took place. The work we are doing when we address collective trauma, I want to say this is not easy work at all. This goes beyond dialogue. This goes beyond bringing people together. This addresses identity, how we identify ourselves as peoples, as nations. If my identity has been embedded in the last 60, 70 years from a traumatic experience, and that has become the shaper of identity, part of trauma healing actually means redesigning identity itself. And so this is not easy work. And to be honest, I don't know if it's possible to do this work or not, but this is what we are trying to do. To engage in the impossible, I think, is what needs to happen to bring a real sense of peace in this land.
Noor or Bilal, would you like to add something?
Yes, I agree with what Sami said. And I think it's very important to do the reconciliation, not just for Palestinians and Israelis. I think that Israelis and Palestinians have some kind of effect or center in the world. If you look around, for example, in the Muslim world and the Arab world in general, and also in the Western world and for Muslim Christians, that we can create a model that can help also in the whole region, not just in Israel and Palestine. That's why I think it's very important, and I think it's also a great responsibility. It's not just an ordinary mission. And to add an example of what I'm seeing around, at least from my perspective, on social media, and I don't know if it's representative of the whole Muslims or Arabs, of course it's not, but I'm seeing that there's a trend of, for example, using Palestinian-Israeli issue in a more religious way. For example, using religious texts and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that Jews are traitors and Jews have been killing prophets in the past, and that I'm seeing also that some Muslims are calling for throwing Jews in the sea, and that this is the destiny of Jews, and that Muslims will do that. And that's why I believe it's very important. It's not just for Palestinians and Israelis, it's for the whole region. I believe that me as a Palestinian, I have a message that I didn't choose to have. I have a mission that I didn't choose to have, which is to try to reconciliation, not just between Palestinians and Israelis, but actually between Jews and Muslims and the Christians.
Thank you, Bilal. Noor, would you like to say anything on this last question?
No, I agree. I agree with what Sami said and with Bilal, and yeah, the whole topic of identity and how how our identity is shaped. I think we should work more on the realization of how our identity is shaped and how we deal with the other side and how we relate to the other side and how it affects us, and it affects the way how we understand the other side suffering and how we deal with it. So yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. At the Pinnacle, we had 100 people on this Zoom call, which was really wonderful. Especially, of course, I'd like to thank our three panelists, Bilal Arar, Noor Awad, and Sami Awad. By the way, Sami and Noor are not related, if anyone's asking. Thank you very much to the three of you for joining us and giving us of your insights and your understanding and your wisdom. I would just like to say, please look at the Roots website, friendsofroots.net. Don't make the mistake of going to friendsofroots.org. Rather, www.friendsofroots.net. And there you can read about the wonderful work that Roots is doing, trying to bring reconciliation to Palestinians and Israelis. I'll also tell you that I hope we'll have a program like this once a week. I hope, I'm not sure. And you'll be contacted about it. Perhaps we'll have a program on Amalek, that subject that Alan brought up. And lastly, actually two things at the end. Those of you who are able to donate to Roots, please do so. A little bit or a lot. We certainly need your help to get through this crisis. On the website, friendsofroots.net, there's a PayPal portal, and there's also an address to send checks to if you're able to help us. Lastly, I'll just tell you that we don't know if we will make the recording of this call public. I have to talk to Noor, Bilal, and Sami. They'll tell us if they think it's possible to make public. If we do make it public, you'll find it on our website. And if you'd like the recording and we decide to let it go public, you can contact me and I'll send it to you. So thank you very, very much for joining us. May the memory of the victims stay with us forever. Thank you.
Thank you. Shukran.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. תודה רבה, שוקרן.